Ethan Carter had always been proud of his sprawling family farm, a patch of land that had been in his bloodline for generations. A hard-working, down-to-earth man with calloused hands and a stubborn streak forged from years of tending the fields, Ethan's life was deeply rooted in the rhythms of nature. Every sunrise brought him hope, and every sunset was a promise kept. His farmhouse, weathered yet dignified, stood at the edge of a vibrant orchard and neatly lined fields. This home wasn't just a building, it was his legacy, a place where his memories grew as steadily as the corn in his fields. But all that tranquility was about to be shattered. Across the county, a new menace was emerging in the form of a notorious neighborhood enforcer, Kerren. As president of the local homeowners association HOA, Kerren's rigid interpretation of community standards had long been a sore spot for many. With her crisp power suits, perfectly coiffed hair, and an unwavering belief in her own authority, Kerren made it her personal mission to micromanage every inch of the community, even the rural fringes that bordered Ethan's property. The trouble began on an otherwise ordinary morning when Ethan, stepping out to check on the irrigation lines powering his equipment, noticed something amiss. His farm's power lines, which ran along the property's edge to energize his equipment shed and critical systems, had been deliberately cut. Shocked and fuming, Ethan quickly pieced together the evidence: a jagged cut in the cable and a smear of paint that matched the HOA's official stationery. The implication was clear. Kerren had struck again. In the ensuing confrontation at the county road, Ethan found himself face to face with Kerren. With a haughty smile, she explained that the power lines were an eyesore and a violation of the strict community standards set by the HOA. To Kerren, every infraction, no matter how trivial, was proof that Ethan was flouting the rules. In her view, personal taste and community aesthetics trumped practicality and family tradition. Ethan, equally passionate about his work and his heritage, refused to let this injustice slide. "I've built this farm with my own hands," he said calmly, though his eyes burned with righteous anger. "These power lines aren't just wires, they're the lifeline of my business." The first sparks of a titanic battle were ignited on that roadside, setting the stage for a conflict that would escalate beyond anyone's wildest expectations. As neighbors watched the exchange from a distance, whispers began to circulate. Some admired Ethan's down-to-earth resilience. Others secretly enjoyed the drama that came with Kerren's overreach. Yet one thing was clear. Kerren's first bold move had exposed the chasm between the rigid, often arbitrary HOA regulations and the gritty reality of rural life. And while Ethan had every right to be indignant, he also realized that this battle wasn't just about power lines. It was about standing up against entitlement. In the following days, as Ethan repaired the damage and sought legal advice, he also began documenting every interaction. His determination to preserve his property and his way of life became personal. What had started as an isolated act of vandalism was now morphing into a struggle for dignity, respect, and the right to live and work without arbitrary interference. At his modest kitchen table, cluttered with blueprints of his farm and letters from local officials, Ethan resolved that he would not let Kerren and her cronies bully him into submission. This was not just about a few dollars worth of damage. It was a fight for every farmer and homeowner who had ever been belittled by an overzealous bureaucracy. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over his fields, Ethan Carter knew that the coming conflict would test not only his resolve, but the very soul of the community. The very next morning, Ethan awoke to an unexpected and unnerving surprise. Taped firmly to the creaking door of his farmhouse was an official-looking notice: a fine of $750 for disturbing the community aesthetic by having power lines that disrupt the visual uniformity of our neighborhood. The document was replete with official seals and legal-sounding jargon, all designed to intimidate. Kerren wasted no time in enforcing the fine. Standing in the driveway with arms folded and a condescending smile, she declared, "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan. There are no exceptions just because you live on a farm." Her tone left no room for debate, and her smug expression only deepened the sense of injustice. Unwilling to be bullied by a board member who seemed to value personal opinion over common sense, Ethan immediately sought clarification. He combed through local ordinances, county regulations, and even historical records of property improvements to build his case. The local laws clearly stated that agricultural properties were exempt from many of the aesthetic rules that the HOA had imposed on suburban neighborhoods. Yet Kerren, with her iron-fisted interpretation of the guidelines, refused to acknowledge these legal nuances. When Ethan formally disputed the fine by filing a complaint with the local zoning office, Kerren's response was swift and merciless. Within hours, inspectors were seen arriving on his property, ostensibly to verify the alleged violation. Their presence was intimidating, and their questions pointedly directed at undermining Ethan's long-established rights as a farmer. Kerren's allies in the HOA were quick to confirm her version of events, leaving Ethan feeling isolated and outnumbered. In the midst of this turmoil, Ethan found solace in his longtime friend and legal advisor, Marvin, a seasoned attorney with a keen understanding of local law. Marvin assured him that the HOA's actions were questionable at best and illegal at worst. "They're using every trick in the book to force you into submission," Marvin explained. "But remember, the law is on your side." This reassurance fortified Ethan's resolve, and he began meticulously documenting every incident, from the unauthorized inspection to the harsh language Kerren used in private communications. Kerren, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on the chaos she had instigated. In staff meetings with other board members, she recounted the morning's events with exaggerated triumph, confident that her tactics would set a precedent. "One disobedient homeowner, and we show them who's boss," she proclaimed, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. But behind closed doors, whispers of doubt began to surface among some of the board members. A few quietly wondered if enforcing such draconian measures on a respected local farmer might eventually tarnish the HOA's reputation. Despite the growing internal unrest, Kerren pressed forward with her campaign of intimidation. New notices arrived at Ethan's door daily, each more menacing than the last. The messages were clear: comply or face even harsher penalties. Yet with each new notice, Ethan's determination only hardened. He was no longer fighting merely for his farm. He was battling for the very principle of fairness and justice. That fateful morning marked the first power move by the HOA, a calculated attempt to silence dissent through legal threats and intimidation. Ethan's careful research and growing evidence, however, laid the groundwork for a counteroffensive that would soon expose the HOA's overreach for what it was: an abuse of power driven by entitlement. As the day faded into a sleepless night filled with plans and strategies, Ethan knew that Kerren's actions were only the beginning. The battle lines had been drawn, and every inspected inch of his land became a testament to the fight for his rights. In the cold glare of the floodlights, with inspectors lingering like vultures and Kerren's smug voice echoing in his ears, Ethan prepared himself for the long, arduous struggle ahead. A struggle that would force the community to choose between blind obedience and the courage to stand up for what was right. In the days that followed, the situation on Ethan's farm spiraled rapidly into a full-blown conflict. Kerren, sensing that her initial strike had only stoked the fire of resistance, began to up the ante. She introduced a series of new regulations that were never part of the original HOA guidelines, false violations intended to keep Ethan in a perpetual state of noncompliance. Kerren's latest decree claimed that not only were the power lines an eyesore, but they also detracted from the historical charm of our community. To enforce her newfound authority, she threatened eviction notices and even hinted at property seizure if Ethan did not correct his property immediately. Anger mixed with disbelief as Ethan pored over the documents. There was no legal basis for these sweeping changes, only Kerren's personal vendetta masquerading as policy. Determined to expose the corruption, Ethan began to investigate the inner workings of the HOA. His inquiries led him to shocking revelations. Several board members had been quietly questioning Kerren's financial decisions, and there were rumors that funds meant for community improvements were being diverted into Kerren's personal bank account. Late one evening, while the farm was cloaked in silence, Ethan installed small cameras around the perimeter of his property. Hidden in the dense brush and peeking from behind aged barnwood, These devices would capture every move made by the HOA's enforcers, every unauthorized inspection, every whispered conversation. Ethan knew that these recordings would serve as the evidence needed to dismantle Kerren's oppressive regime. His investigation soon uncovered a disturbing pattern. Neighbors, once too intimidated to speak, began confiding in him about similar injustices. Mrs. Delgado, whose property had been hit with an inexplicable fee for improper fence alignment, revealed that her fine had been mysteriously erased after she paid a donation to the HOA's secret fund. Another homeowner, a retired schoolteacher named Linda, recounted how Kerren had used vague safety concerns to justify an illegal inspection of her property, leaving her family distressed and harassed. Armed with this mounting evidence, Ethan started reaching out to other affected residents. Late-night meetings were held at his farmhouse, quiet gatherings of frustrated community members united by a shared sense of injustice. Together, they compiled a dossier of irregularities, forged documents, unexplained financial discrepancies, and the clear abuse of power. The more Ethan uncovered, the more it became apparent that Kerren's campaign was not simply about aesthetic control. It was a deliberate effort to extract money from the community and silence dissent. One board member, a quiet man named Henry, who had long harbored doubts about Kerren's decisions, began to slip him crucial information. In hushed tones and secret emails, Henry revealed that Kerren had been pocketing funds and even manipulating records to hide her misdeeds. This insider tip was the turning point. It meant that Ethan wasn't alone in his fight. A seed of rebellion had been planted within the very organization that was meant to protect the community. But as Ethan's case grew stronger, Kerren's tactics became even more underhanded. With every piece of evidence Ethan collected, she retaliated by ramping up her intimidation campaign. Private investigators were hired to shadow Ethan's movements, and anonymous complaints started flooding local offices, all designed to discredit him and paint him as a troublemaker. Kerren's voice, once the embodiment of HOA authority, now rang hollow in the face of solid evidence of her misconduct. The conflict reached a fever pitch during a heated board meeting. In front of a half-dozen board members and several unsuspecting community residents, Ethan calmly presented his dossier. Photographs of tampered cables, audio recordings of illicit conversations, and financial records detailing misappropriated funds were laid out in stark detail. The room fell silent as the undeniable proof of corruption hung in the air. Even those who had been loyal to Kerren shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions betraying the truth that Ethan had so carefully unveiled. In that charged atmosphere, Ethan's voice cut through the tension. "This isn't about some silly fence or a handful of dollars. It's about integrity," he declared. "Our community deserves to be governed by fairness, not by the whims of one self-appointed enforcer." The words resonated, and for a brief moment, even Kerren's closest allies looked as though they were considering a different path. Yet despite the damning evidence and the stirring of public sentiment, Kerren's defiant glare spoke volumes. She was not prepared to relinquish her power without a fight. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine not only the fate of Ethan's farm, but also the future of the entire neighborhood. With every secret recorded, every whispered confession, and every anonymous tip, Ethan was building a case that would expose the rotten core of the HOA. And as the community's discontent grew, it became increasingly clear that Kerren's days as the iron-fisted arbiter of the neighborhood were numbered. The escalating confrontation as Kerren resorts to extreme measures and Ethan finds his moment to publicly expose the corruption. In this segment, the tension reaches a fever pitch. Kerren orders the towing of Ethan's equipment, shuts off essential utilities under the guise of safety, and even initiates a series of spurious lawsuits against him. Meanwhile, Ethan gathers his legal documents, records each outrageous move on his cameras, and prepares for a public confrontation at the next HOA meeting. Late one overcast morning, Ethan awoke to a scene straight out of a nightmare. Heavy machinery was parked near his barn, and several trucks were unloading equipment by the farm's perimeter. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, a tow truck's hydraulics hissed as it hooked onto his prized tractor. A note written in bold red ink was taped to the cab, unauthorized equipment, removal in progress. It was a message as clear as it was devastating. Kerren was taking her war against him into uncharted, illegal territory. The shock was compounded when, later that day, Ethan discovered that the power had been cut off, not just the tampered power lines, but the entire electrical system powering his irrigation, lighting, and critical farm operations. Kerren's representative claimed that the disruption was necessary for safety upgrades and community protection. In truth, it was a deliberate move meant to cripple Ethan's livelihood and force him into submission. But Ethan was prepared. Having spent the previous weeks methodically gathering evidence, he now had every irregularity documented. With his cameras, recording, and every conversation logged, he contacted a local attorney well-versed in property rights and agricultural law. The legal expert confirmed that the HOA's actions were not only in violation of local regulations, but bordered on criminal interference with business operations. Ethan's fight was no longer just a personal vendetta. It was a stand against an abusive system. That evening, at the scheduled HOA meeting held in the town's community center, the atmosphere was electric. Board members, residents, and even local media gathered, expecting Kerren's usual polished spiel. Instead, they were met with an unwavering Ethan Carter, who arrived with a meticulously organized file of evidence. As Kerren took the podium and launched into a rehearsed monologue about community standards and protecting our neighborhood's image, Ethan calmly interrupted. "I'm here to present the truth," he declared, holding up printouts of financial records, photographs of the tow truck on my property, and video clips of the unauthorized power shutdown. A murmur rippled through the crowd. For the first time, several board members exchanged uncertain glances. The evidence was undeniable. Kerren had overstepped every boundary, acting not as a community guardian, but as a petty dictator fixated on control and profit. One by one, community members began to stand up, recounting their own experiences with the HOA's overreach, stories of random fines, unexplained fees, and intrusive inspections. Kerren's face flushed as her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. With her voice rising in panic, she attempted to discredit Ethan by accusing him of fabricating evidence. But the mounting documentation and the honest testimonies of residents left little room for doubt. The local press, present in the room, began asking pointed questions about the legality of the HOA's actions, further pressuring Kerren to defend her decisions. In the heat of the confrontation, Ethan's voice resonated with a mix of anger and determination. "This isn't just about my farm. It's about every single homeowner who's been bullied and manipulated by an organization that cares more about profit than about people." His words struck a chord with the audience, and slowly, the tide began to turn. Even longtime supporters of Kerren started questioning her decisions, their loyalty shaken by the overwhelming evidence of her misconduct. Despite the mounting opposition, Kerren refused to back down. Even as board members hesitated and community members voiced their support for Ethan, she stubbornly clung to her outdated policies and half-truths. But the damage was done. The seeds of dissent had been sown, and the once unassailable authority of the HOA was now under siege. That meeting marked the turning point in the battle. Ethan's bold public exposure not only laid bare the corruption within the HOA, but also signaled that no one, not even Kerren, was above accountability. The community's united stance proved that when citizens stand together, even the most draconian rules can be challenged. And as Kerren's frantic attempts to regain control grew increasingly desperate, Ethan's steady determination shone as a beacon of justice, a promise that the abuse of power would not be tolerated any longer. The climax is Kerren, driven by desperation, resorts to her most extreme tactics yet. In a final attempt to salvage her control, she calls in the police to create a spectacle, engages in trespassing, and even employs dubious private investigators. In a twist of fate, her actions are recorded and become the damning evidence that seals her fate. Ethan's calm yet resolute counterattack exposes every illegal maneuver in excruciating detail. On what appeared to be a deceptively ordinary day, the tension on the farm reached a crescendo. Kerren, now cornered and desperate to reassert her authority, orchestrated what she believed would be her final, decisive strike. With a phone call to the local police station, She reported that Ethan's blinding public disturbance caused by his excess porch lighting was endangering the community. In truth, the porch lights were nothing more than a modest effort to ensure safety on a dark country road. But in Kerren's eyes, any deviation from her aesthetic ideal was grounds for action. Within minutes, a squad car pulled up in front of Ethan's farmhouse. The officers, unfamiliar with the ongoing dispute and the subtle intricacies of rural property rights, arrived prepared to investigate a complaint that was as baseless as it was theatrically presented. Ethan, who had anticipated Kerren's next move, calmly approached the police and flashed his credentials as a local official with intimate knowledge of zoning laws and property rights. The situation quickly spiraled when Kerren's privately hired security consultant, a man with a questionable past, was caught on one of Ethan's hidden cameras sneaking around the side of the property. As the police began questioning the motives behind the complaint, Ethan produced the meticulously gathered evidence. A video clip of the security consultant's covert trespassing, documents verifying that the power lines were installed according to county regulations, and even a recording of Kerren's own admissions to an HOA board member that the new fine system was a shortcut to revenue. The assembled evidence not only undermined Kerren's claims, but painted a vivid picture of a woman willing to bend the rules to maintain her crumbling control. In the ensuing chaos, Kerren's carefully crafted facade of authority began to disintegrate. The officers, realizing that the complaint might be more about Kerren's personal vendetta than any genuine public disturbance, questioned her further. Under pressure, Kerren attempted to deflect blame by accusing Ethan of instigating the altercation and even went so far as to threaten legal action if the officers did not back her version of events. But her arguments fell flat when the evidence was played back in the presence of everyone in the community center, including several local journalists who had gathered to cover the controversial HOA meeting. The turning point came when Ethan revealed the security footage at the next HOA meeting, a recording that captured not only the trespassing incident, but also an incriminating conversation in which Kerren bragged about getting away with it, while her office phone buzzed with messages from an anonymous tipster. The room erupted in outrage as the once untouchable Kerren was forced to confront the undeniable proof of her illegal activities. As the police concluded their investigation and the local media began to broadcast the story, it was clear that Kerren's desperate gambit had backfired spectacularly. Her call for law enforcement, intended to intimidate and silence, instead became the catalyst for her public humiliation. With each new piece of evidence, Ethan's case against her grew stronger, and so did the resolve of the community to reclaim their rights. In the days that followed, Kerren's behavior became increasingly erratic. Attempts to spin the story in her favor only led to further scrutiny of her personal conduct and the questionable practices of the HOA. It was as if every step she took to maintain control pushed her further into the spotlight, leaving her with no choice but to face the music. For Ethan, this was poetic justice. The person who had tried to use every trick in the book to bully a hardworking farmer was now having her own house of cards collapse around her. By the end of the day, Kerren's final, desperate move had been recorded, documented, and circulated far and wide. The evidence was irrefutable, and the community's sentiment had clearly shifted. No longer could she hide behind her false claims of protecting community standards. In a final public showdown that left no room for doubt, Ethan's calm, measured response and his unyielding commitment to the truth exposed every facet of her corruption. And as the chapter closed on that tumultuous day, it was evident that Kerren's reign of terror was rapidly coming to an end. The unraveling of the HOA and Kerren's ultimate public downfall. In this phase, the community's uprising becomes unstoppable. Kerren is forced from her position as the tyrannical enforcer, and the entire structure she helped build begins to collapse. Ethan, now vindicated, watches as the oppressive system crumbles before him. The fallout was swift and dramatic. In the wake of Kerren's public debacle, homeowners, long intimidated by her arbitrary fines and hostile inspections, found their collective voice. Within days, what had once been a silent majority was galvanized into action. A special meeting was convened, and with the tide of public opinion firmly against her, Kerren was ousted from the HOA board in a resounding vote of no confidence. News of the community's revolt spread like wildfire. Local media outlets picked up the story, amplifying the voices of those who had suffered under Kerren's regime. An investigation was launched into the financial irregularities within the HOA, and it soon emerged that Kerren had been diverting funds meant for communal repairs into her own pockets. The evidence presented by Ethan, now supported by multiple testimonies and insider tips from former board members, left little room for doubt. With every new revelation, the legitimacy of the HOA itself began to crumble. Within a week, the city intervened. The local government, alarmed by the blatant abuse of power and the potential for similar injustices in other communities, fined the HOA a staggering $50,000 for illegally enforcing rules that had no legal standing. The fine wasn't just a penalty. It was a public declaration that such overreach would not be tolerated. The once mighty organization that had enforced Kerren's whims was now under the microscope, its leadership disbanded, and its policies under review. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. The long, arduous battle had taken a personal toll, but the sense of justice he felt was immeasurable. Sitting on his newly restored porch, a symbol of resilience and hard-won freedom, he savored the moment as neighbors gathered to celebrate the downfall of the tyrant. "We did it," one of them remarked, a statement that resonated throughout the crowd. The oppressive grip of an overreaching authority had been broken, and the community was finally free to govern itself in a fair, transparent manner. Meanwhile, Kerren's fate became a public spectacle. Unable to defend herself against the mounting evidence and public outrage, she was forced to resign. Rumors spread that her personal finances were in shambles, and that she might soon be forced to sell her own home to cover mounting debts. The once feared enforcer, who had wielded power with an iron fist, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that entitlement and abuse of power always come with a price. As the dust settled, the community embarked on a journey of rebuilding trust and establishing new, fairer guidelines for managing their neighborhood. Ethan, having led the charge, was hailed as a champion of justice, a man who had dared to stand up against corruption and tyranny. The symbolic victory was a turning point not only for him, but for every resident who had once cowered under the weight of arbitrary fines and intrusive oversight. In a final, triumphant gesture, the city's inspector general announced a sweeping reform of the HOA regulations, ensuring that no individual could ever again impose such draconian measures without accountability. Ethan's farm, once the target of relentless bullying, now stood as a beacon of resilience, a testament to the power of community and the importance of standing up for one's rights. And as Kerren's influence faded into oblivion, the community celebrated a newfound sense of unity and freedom. The battle had been hard-fought, but the victory was sweet. And as Ethan sipped his coffee on that now peaceful porch, he couldn't help but smile at the poetic justice that had finally prevailed. The focus to the legal ramifications of the HOA's misdeeds. In this portion, details of lawsuits, official fines, and regulatory reforms are laid out, along with Ethan's final decisive move that cements the community's victory. The legal backlash was swift. With the evidence mounting against the HOA's questionable practices, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the affected homeowners. The city, alarmed by the blatant disregard for local regulations, initiated an investigation that soon revealed systemic corruption throughout the organization. Key board members, once shielded by Kerren's authoritarian rule, now found themselves under the scrutiny of state authorities. The court proceedings, held over a series of tense days, exposed the full extent of the financial misappropriations and illegal fines levied by the HOA. The judge, unimpressed by Kerren's feeble attempts to justify her actions, ruled that the HOA's practices were not only illegal, but had caused significant distress to the community. A multi-million-dollar fine was levied against the organization, and several board members faced further legal action. Ethan, who had been instrumental in gathering the evidence and rallying the community, made one final, symbolic move during the hearings. In a short, impassioned statement, he declared, "This isn't just about money. It's about the dignity of every homeowner in this community. Today, we reclaim our rights." His words resonated far beyond the courtroom, marking the definitive end of the HOA's tyranny. The ruling also mandated that the HOA be dissolved and its funds frozen pending a thorough audit. It was a clear message to any organization that might be tempted to abuse its power. There would be accountability, and justice would prevail. The legal victory served as the final nail in the coffin for the corrupt system that had long oppressed the community. For Ethan and his neighbors, it wasn't just a win in court. It was the restoration of trust and fairness. With the HOA disbanded and new management practices put in place by the city, the community began a fresh chapter, one that promised transparency and mutual respect. The personal humiliation and downfall of Kerren. This chapter details the unraveling of her once impenetrable facade and the public shaming that follows her legal and social defeat. In the aftermath of the legal verdict, Kerren found herself facing a cascade of personal disasters. Once revered as the unwavering enforcer of community standards, she was now the subject of scorn and ridicule. The media relentlessly chronicled her every misstep, and social media became awash with memes and hashtags that mocked her authority. Her personal life, once meticulously guarded, was laid bare for all to see. Within days, the pressures became too overwhelming. Rumors spread that Kerren's personal finances were in serious disarray, forcing her to liquidate assets just to pay off mounting debts. Her car was repossessed, and even her once stylish wardrobe was deemed out of reach. In a particularly bitter twist, Kerren was forced to relinquish her home, a property she had once flaunted as a symbol of her power, resulting in a public auction that drew both pity and derision. In one final moment of public humiliation, Ethan happened upon Kerren at a local community event. There she was, no longer the imperious HOA president, but a meek figure working as an assistant property manager for another HOA, a role that seemed to mock her former position. With a wry smile and a tone heavy with irony, Ethan remarked, "I hope you like following the rules now." His words, though gentle, encapsulated the poetic justice of the situation, leaving onlookers both amused and vindicated. For Kerren, every day became a reminder of her fall from grace. The community that once trembled under her arbitrary rules now openly celebrated her defeat. Neighbors recounted tales of her previous misdeeds with a blend of schadenfreude and relief. Her legacy, once defined by unyielding authority, was now a cautionary tale about the dangers of entitlement and unchecked power. The narrative with a reflective look at the community in the wake of Kerren's downfall, closing on a humorous, yet triumphant note. As summer waned into a crisp autumn, the neighborhood slowly began to settle into a new era of transparency and communal respect. Ethan Carter, now a local hero, could be seen every morning sitting on his porch, a symbol of resilience and the triumph of justice over tyranny. The once oppressive silence that had blanketed the community was replaced by laughter, lively conversation, and a renewed sense of unity. At community gatherings, old grievances were replaced with stories of how the HOA had once overreached. Neighbors, who had been victims of inexplicable fines and baseless inspections, now shared inside jokes about Kerren's rules, and the day when a single act of defiance changed everything. One resident even cheekily handed Ethan a novelty violation notice for having too many chickens, a playful nod to the absurdity of past regulations. In a final light-hearted twist, a local radio host dedicated an entire segment to the saga of Kerren's rise and fall, describing it as a modern-day David versus Goliath tale, where a humble farmer triumphed over bureaucracy. Ethan's quiet smile as he listened to the broadcast was a silent acknowledgement that sometimes the smallest voice can indeed bring down the mightiest of empires. The story of Kerren and the HOA would live on as a lesson in civic engagement, a reminder that no one is above the law and that the collective strength of a community can overturn even the most entrenched systems of power. And as Ethan's farmhouse stood proudly under a starlit sky, its power lines humming quietly with the energy of a hard-fought victory, it was clear that this was not the end, but the beginning of a better, fairer future. With a final mic drop moment that left everyone chuckling and inspired, the community signed off on a new chapter. As the credits of the day rolled out in the warm glow of twilight, Ethan raised his cup in a silent toast to justice, community, and the sweet taste of victory over entitlement.